Hi, and welcome to another episode of Trek Yards. I'm Andre, and this is Jeff,
How you doing?
and doing pretty good today. And today is our second episode of this podcast, second official episode, and today we're going to be talking about First Contact, not the movie particularly. That'll be mentioned, but we're going to be talking about the concept of first contact between the Federation and other alien societies. Now, First Contact originally took place, I believe it was after a Third World War in Bozeman, Montana in 1963, after Zephram Cochrane made his first Warp 1, I guess you could say Warp 1 flight on the Phoenix, and the Vulcans uh, noticed him, and they came to Earth after that to make what they called First Contact. And and that was on April 5th. And in the Star Trek universe, they still celebrate First Contact Day. In Voyager, they did that. They actually had a First Contact Day in the Delta Quadrant on the Starship Voyager on many series later. But, one of the issues of First Contact that first came around was that it was something that seemed to be precipitated by Vulcans. And we saw it actually done in The Next Generation, but you've been mentioning this quite a bit lately in our conversations about the Vulcans' relationship to humans when they first met them. And we know that a group of Vulcans actually went to Earth in the 1950s and didn't officially make first contact, but they did with Zephram Cochrane over 100 years later. But you mentioned that in the 22nd century, the relationship between Vulcans and humanity actually changed. Could you go a little bit into that schism between First Contact and the events of Enterprise?
Okay. Well, the first thing I wanted to point out to everyone watching is that, in my opinion, I don't think Gene Roddenberry would have went the route that Enterprise took with the Vulcans. I think his idea of what the future would be like is that humanity would have managed to get out of its problems on its own without any help from Vulcans or any other alien race for that matter. And I think what he envisioned was that humanity would have struck out into space and encountered the Vulcans, their world or something like that, as one of the first life forms they encountered. But putting that aside and just speaking on what they did with First Contact, yeah, when the Vulcans showed up, in the movie The First Contact, uh, I guess the Vulcans at that time, for some reason, felt that it was okay to, come to Earth after. I mean, they must have known Earth had just come out of a major war, but because humanity had reached warp speed, I guess they figured that it was imperative that they come to Earth somehow and see to it that the humans weren't destructive or using like what happened. Remember in the mirror universe episode on Enterprise when Vulcan showed up and
Yeah,
they got
Zephram Cochrane shot him.
yeah. So I think what they were doing is they were trying to ascertain uh, how humanity was, if they were violent people or if they had, or if they were peaceful people. And I think that was it was First Contact, but it was it was more of an assessment, not so much that they were trying to introduce humanity to all the the possibilities of what's out there, but they were just trying to find out if they were a danger. Now we fast forward into Star Trek Enterprise, and we see the Vulcans taking an active role in what humans are doing out in space, and so humanity, I guess, kind of learned from them at some point that they shouldn't interfere, with the lower level of species that don't have achieved warp speed yet or anything like that. Uh, I think it was an idea that they initially agreed to, but when they actually put it in practice, I don't think like what happened with Archer. I don't think they really could resist the temptation to try to help or try to avert other worlds' disasters or something like that. and it was something that humanity had to learn along the way, and it took quite a while for them to do it until we come up to the TOS era, where we actually see them implementing that idea as policy. And I mean, there were still some episodes in TOS where some of the starship captains would kind of violate the Prime Directive and for their own advantage or something like that, but it was probably not so widespread. It was just maybe a few people here and there that would do that.
Now that you mention it, it's interesting because what inspired this was a video by a friend of mine. I told you about this, named Steve Shives. A little shout out to you, Steve. I know you're out here on YouTube and Facebook and everything. And it was about, is the Prime Directive really a very good law or directive? And one of the questions I wanted to ask you, it being that the Vulcans' first encounter with Zephram Cochrane was really more an observation, perhaps a prelude to first contact, rather than an official first contact procedure. I was wondering, do you think that the non-interference directive, the Prime Directive, as it were, that the Federation adopted, that was being developed in Enterprise, was something that came out of Vulcan procedures on first contact with alien worlds, or that they're totally unrelated things?
No, I think the Vulcans, if you take what happened on Enterprise, as canon or whatever, I think what they were saying is that Vulcans really were over the human shoulder pretty much on everything. They were deliberately holding them back from getting, going too fast with their warp speed and stuff like that. They didn't
want micromanaging,
Yeah, they were, there were certain technologies they didn't want them to have too soon. I think, it was something they wanted the humans to understand, and I think having T'Pol on the ship was a further extension of that philosophy for them to say, well, okay, you go on the ship and make sure when they go out there that they're not messing around with other worlds and stuff like that, basically, and that's what I think she was really there for, not just as a son.
And that basically would make her kind of a mother hen in a way. She was there to say, you're not doing the right thing, you're not going where you're supposed to go. Again, kind of micromanaging figures. And, when I look back on it, I remember watching Broken Bow for the first time, and that kind of plays into it. There's a scene, I'm sure you remember it. I don't remember what specific situation it was. They were looking for this Klingon, I think, who had escaped or whatever. They were trying to bring this Klingon back to his people or whatever. They never met Klingons before humanity. And Paul and Trip were on this planet, and there was this baby who was crying or sick or whatever, and this mother kept putting this gas mask on him, and Trip was ready to jump in and say, you're trying to kill that child, and you're trying to do all this. And T'Pol explained he can't breathe the air on this planet, so she has to give him special equipment and special respirating devices. And she said to him, if you're going to be in the cosmos, you have to learn to objectify other cultures so you know when to interfere and when not to. And so you do see it right in that pilot, but still, with the aloof attitude, as you said, of Vulcans during the original series and during the Next Generation, having their logic, I can't see them as being those mother hen figures in the Enterprise era so much. More participants and helpful when they felt it was necessary, but not holding things back and acting like, well, we're just going to give them what they can handle. We're going to look at them as parental figures and their children. I didn't see that kind of parochial attitude, before Enterprise. But, back to the issue of first contact, I'm going to flash forward a bit here. We didn't really explore first contact with an alien race in TOS, did we, per se? I don't remember looking back at TOS that we ever really explored it that much. We had Prime Directive issues with pre-warp civilizations, and ships like in Piece of the Action who had interfered with other planets before the Prime Directive was really that involved, I guess, in Federation policy. But we really didn't see an episode about first contact procedures until the Next Generation. And it was actually called First Contact. I used to have the worst confusion, the movie, the episode. And they were not really exactly about the same thing, but they dealt with the same situation. I'll just give you a little subtext here before we get into it. As you know, but everybody else was watching this. First Contact was an episode of The Next Generation where a race was about to discover warp drive, actually, and Commander Riker was disguised as a member of this race, and he had been injured, and they had discovered him, but they didn't know other aliens existed in the universe. And it forced a premature first contact from Counselor Troy and Captain Picard, and they decided to seek out scientists, because they said scientists were usually more receptive to the understanding of alien races. And in addition to doing that, they also ran into a schism where there were people on this planet who were not interested in this change, and the first contact did not work. Now, they explain some first contact procedures, such as sending down agents in disguise to look at the civilization, their art, their culture, their politics, their traditions, their religion, before going too far. Do you think there are any other rules of first contact procedures that could have been a little better defined even at that point?
Oh, other rules. Well, I guess interaction with other people would have to be limited.
Yeah.
A person might slip up and say something that's, that could influence people's way of perceiving things. I would think that would be one thing. Let's see. I guess basically try not to interact, I suppose, with if you're just there to observe. Because like what Riker was doing, they were sort of like infiltrating in a way just to get a take on what the whole society was like. Listening to people, watching what they're doing, what they're listening to. They had television. I remember they had a line in that episode where they were talking about how weird we must seem, if you look at what we watch on television or something like that.
I think that could apply to humanity too. We're being looked at. What are they thinking of the Kardashians or whatever? I mean, what are they thinking of all that? It's just kind of a funny thought.
It was they use that race as sort of like a mirror of us, of humanity. Like what would we be like to people visiting us to see how we were? That was kind of
exactly. The human condition exploration. One of the funny things, I think around the time that episode was made, I think 91, maybe 90, something like that, when that episode was made, I remember there was this article that I read around that time. I was about 11. And it was talking about how, because of the time barrier, if an alien race at a certain distance is getting media from our planet now, they're going to be getting things like I Love Lucy or radio broadcasts from the 50s. So, unless they have a way to traverse that, as they do in the Star Trek universe, they're looking a little bit further into our past. So, it's interesting to understand that conundrum. And Star Trek, they've been able to deal with that time barrier. So, obviously, they can be right there and understand a lot better than we could in our time, another culture, from another world, because they've been able to traverse those barriers. And like you said, it would be funny to an alien race to say, oh, what must you think of us looking at our music or our popular, I think they called it broadcast, though. It was meant to be TV, but they called it broadcasts.
Yeah.
In the episode. Yeah, it was TV. It was TV. They just chose a different name. They could have chose other stupid names, but they chose broadcast, which is sensible. But, and here's another question for you. It's kind of interrelated. Do you think in the TOS era, I haven't read all the Star Trek novels, which are not canon, or read every comic. I'm sure they have in many of those things done this. Do you think it would have been good, like maybe in a supposed fourth season of TOS, if they had explored with Kirk and Spock and Bones and that crew, a first contact with an alien race that was more official, how it would have worked in that time?
Well, let me start off by saying that most of the time on TOS, whenever they were confronted by something that was, a new life form or something like that, or whatever, something new, they were always trying to get away from it to go on with their mission of charting worlds and nebula. And I'm thinking, well, every episode when they started off was, we're in strange new worlds and new life forms, right? And it seemed like Spock was the only one on the ship that was really taking the effort of understanding oddities. And everybody else was interested in we got to do our mission. We got missions to do and stuff. And it's like, well, their mission is to, what they're doing.
That's a good point. I think that a lot of people may miss. In the Next Generation, Picard was such a romantic figure, as a person, and he would always say, and Janeway too. Remember, there's coffee in that nebula. The whole idea was that let's go chase something around. Let's go see into that wormhole or peek behind that nebula or whatever stellar phenomenon you run into. And with Kirk would be, the theme song would say, well, we explore strange new worlds, but then when they do that, we say, well, we had an assignment from Starfleet we've got to finish. Let's not bother with a new world, like you said. Let's just do what we need to do. So, and then Spock would be the one, like, let's study this situation.
Yeah.
It's logical to study this, so whatever it was. And he'd have his tricorder or his little blue thing. I don't know what the name of that little sensor he looked into.
A good example would be when they encountered Apollo. I mean, here was something that would be a dream to meet somebody from Earth's past. And Kirk was all, let go of my ship and let us go. And if I think Picard in that situation would probably be, let's talk to this guy. Let's learn from him. Let's find out what we could do to help him or something like that,
That's a unique first contact situation you mentioned right there, because you have this life force entity who can assume different sizes and different forms from a race of people who are worshipped as God in the ancient Mediterranean. This is a totally new life form. Now, I personally feel Picard or Janeway would have been all over that.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Our tricorders and our tools, and let's study this before we get too into dealing with him. We'll deal with him later, but we'll study him and ask him questions first, then we'll deal with him if he's going to be a problem. But let's not say, well, you've got my ship, and let's just deal with you now. But that's why I think they say that Kirk, even Spock said, Kirk used a lot of cowboy diplomacy.
Yeah.
Forget studying, shoot to kill, boing, So I think, though, let's just, I'm just going to lecture you about how wonderful we are, how terrible you are, whatever, So I think that, like I said, that's personally just why, in terms of exploration and actually exploring the universe around you, the Next Generation and Voyager really took the cake. I mean, Voyager true had a good opportunity being so far outside Federation space, so yeah, that's a good, and Voyager. Now that I think about it, would it be safe to say that Voyager technically made more first contacts than any other starship we've seen?
Well, you got to think, most of the time Voyager was out there, their only priority was to get home.
Right.
So they have all these dire emergencies they had to answer in Starfleet or something like that. So they could take their time pretty much when they would find a new world or something and just, stop over for a little bit and see how it is and study a little bit.
Now, I don't know if Janeway sometimes did not follow clear first contact procedures just by necessity. Although there was an episode of Voyager, I can't recall the name of it now, I've seen it many times, In the Flesh was the name of it, where the species 8472 are doing what the Soviet Union used to do, build these mock American towns, and even Tom Paris mentioned this. They built this whole holographic Starfleet world and tried to pretend to be human and all this. And in the end, they end up having this conference, and they seem to be having first contact with this very alien species that are closer to being insectoid than human. So she's literally making contact with a life form not only outside the Alpha Quadrant, but outside space as we know it. They live in fluidic space outside our space-time continuum. So this is a totally new...
You also had a situation where 8472 was trying to understand humanity. Maybe not in the respect of trying to relate to us, but they were doing the same thing pretty much for different reasons to try to understand humanity. So here you have two races coming together to learn from each other. And yeah, you're right. That's a good example of having a first contact.
Because in the end, the crew were debating that, they could be using this to try to kill us, and they didn't trust humanity. True. Chakotay found that out dealing with a member of the species, pretending to be in the simulation. But they also found out that, there was mutual distrust on both sides, and in that very Star Trek-y way, they realized that, okay, we'll give them the nanoprobe technology from the Borg we could use to destroy them, because as Janeway told the Ray Walston character, the guy pretending to be Boothby, we didn't know the Borg started the war with you. And we know that you're a threat to us, so I'd rather call a truce and make some sort of peace with us. Now, as he said in the end, I don't know how our leaders will react, but maybe it'll be a good thing. We never heard from them again in Voyager, so I'm assuming that it probably wasn't bad.
Yeah.
They probably realized, yeah, these people aren't who we thought. They have a moral agenda. They misunderstood something, and we can deal with this. So I think, I think Voyager dealt with First Contact. Sometimes they faltered because of the alien race, like with the Kazon. They couldn't really make effective First Contact with them. To me, the Kazon weren't trying very hard. They just weren't.
Everything started on the wrong foot with the Kazon because of the array there.
Right, and getting them out there, the array. And then Seska going in there and screwing it up even more. And she really screwed up a lot. So... and
that was another thing of First Contact, of learning something new, And Janeway did kind of, in a way, try to learn from it. She wasn't really like, Kirk would have been, I guess, kind of bulldoze over the guy or something like that. But, they kind of were, trying to understand the caretaker. That way they could maybe try to help it in some way, and maybe that would probably get her a ticket back to the Alpha Quadrant, or so, sort of.
Well, and like I said, Kirk was the first guy we saw on Star Trek, the first captain. So, I don't want to seem like I'm knocking Kirk. Kirk had his definite Horatio Hornblower aspect that, Gene wanted to give him. But, I got to say, he was a very ethical person in a lot of ways. He did question things. But at the end of the day, he was all about, I want to protect my ship with 430 people.
Yeah, well, you're looking at a man that was still in a young age in his life, where he,
in the 30s, I think.
30s, where Picard was a veteran captain,
right.
And he'd
been around the block a little bit. Yeah,
he had way more experience as being Starfleet. So I think that aspect of Kirk and having the wisdom of Spock next to him kind of made a balance.
That triad. Yeah. You have the intense humanity, and I guess a friend of mine named Henrique, who I talked to a lot out in the Bay Area about Star Trek. Hi to you, Henry. He mentioned once that he saw Bones as being what he called a reactive liberal, in the sense that he had that very humanistic attitude, but he wanted to go in there and interfere sometimes, and Spock had to counter that, and Kirk had to make the decision. So there was that triad they had. Now, with Picard, when it came to First Contact procedures, he had Riker to kind of, I guess, provide a united front with him, and Troy, to say they're hiding something, I guess, would be the operative term. So they would have to
understand their state of mind, their mood.
Right, her empathic sense. Now, Janeway, in terms of First Contact, dealing with other races, she was on Voyager, fresh from being a science officer on this other ship. I think it was called the Al-Batani. And I don't know if she'd been a first officer or anything, but she was a new captain, if I understand it. She wasn't an old figure. About Kirk's age, I'm guessing. About Kirk's age when he was on the Enterprise.
I would say probably a little bit older, but yeah, okay.
Maybe closer to late 30s, early 40s. But yeah, she wasn't a veteran by any means. She was a new captain, and she gets into this insane mission where she's out in the middle of the Delta Quadrant, and basically, except for a few little incidences like the Borg, she manages to effectively make first contact with a number of planets and avert a number of situations that could be very, very troubling.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they did deal with First Contact very heavily in Voyager. Now, Deep Space Nine First Contact. I wanted to mention this because I had issues with it very early on. They said, when they were describing Deep Space Nine, in terms of First Contact with alien races, the alien races are going to come to the space station.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
So I wonder if that, with Deep Space Nine, they started to move more toward a serialized thing about a specific situation, the Dominion, one alien race, not so much encountering other alien races. I'm wondering if they found that the idea of aliens coming to Deep Space Nine and making first contact with them wasn't working. I mean, do you think that affected why they kind of focused on one singular kind of situation?
Maybe. I mean, they did that a lot in the first 2 or 3 seasons of Deep Space Nine. They would have visitors from the Gamma Quadrant come through the wormhole and stuff like that. And I think that when they wanted to make the television show more appealing, they wanted to make it more action oriented and bring in a familiar face and kind of go in that direction where, I mean, they still had a couple of first contacts, with the Spree, I think was one there.
The alien race that flaked, that had the dry scalp, yeah. and
then
they
they met.
slept with males.
Yeah,
They were polygamous, and it was a very interesting alien race. And they still mention the Dominion. They were
yeah,
starting to mention the Dominion with
and
them.
yeah, they were setting up. They were setting up for that. But I think at the same time, during the Dominion War, didn't they meet a race of people that had a blight, and it was
The
given to them.
quickening, yeah.
Quickening, yeah,
They were.
and well, that was a new race.
It wasn't the Dominion War. It was kind of when they had just first met the Dominion, and the changelings were just starting to come around. And Dax and Bashir had to help cure this alien race of this quickening. But again, the
Yeah,
Dominion had bought to that race,
yeah.
so it
And
was kind of
they used to be, as advanced as Starfleet at the time, I guess, from what
right,
we learned.
exactly. And the Blight had
And,
destroyed that. But the
yeah,
thing about that too is I have this one from the first season, and they never really expanded on this much. It was kind of a one shot. I don't know if you've heard this idea about Deep Space Nine. I've heard about it a lot. O'Brien Must Suffer. And this was an episode that kind of dealt with that.
hmm,
He encountered an alien who called himself Tosk, and his sole existence was to be hunting fodder.
yeah,
And so that was an interesting first contact, dealing with a moral, ethical issue. Do I prevent this from happening? Do I let him escape? All that sort of thing. And O'Brien had to deal with breaking rules with Cisco and all that. But,
yeah.
I think with Deep Space Nine, would it be fair to say that First Contact became more of a catalyst for character development rather than its own thing?
Um, yeah, I would think so. I mean, I think it was like after that came out that it was like they started to do
Right.
more
Yeah.
episodes,
Because
in the series.
that O'Brien thing was an O'Brien story, right? And the
Yeah,
quickening, that was basically a Bashir story. Dax was in it, but it was about him coming to terms with ethical situations with that planet
that's
and
right.
what happened there. But Deep Space Nine, and this is just this is not a knock at Deep Space Nine per se, but at the time I used to call it a TV version of Casablanca in space. They had the lounge singer and they had all these kind of big World War II. It started to get kind of like a World War II era film in a lot of ways toward the end, where the focus was so singular. And I wondered, why couldn't they just bring the Dominion down and encounter more of these life forms from the Gamma Quadrant? Because the Gamma Quadrant, I just couldn't believe the whole thing would just. I mean, they call themselves the Dominion, but you couldn't tell me the Dominion just controlled every single aspect of the Gamma Quadrant. There must have been other species that were withdrawn from them, or they had withdrawn from them, and were living independently. And I would love to have seen more of that.
I think it would have worked better if they would have had this conflict in the Gamma Quadrant the whole time instead of in the Alpha Quadrant, by getting
Exactly.
allies in the Gamma Quadrant to rise up and help Starfleet
Right.
to keep the Dominion, and that would
Keep it localized, yeah.
it would have sort of changed the whole dynamic of that part of the galaxy by having the people that were abusing all these worlds basically being subjugated now under the people they were beating up and everything.
Yeah.
So,
well, what's interesting? I don't know if they set up a base per se in the Gamma Quadrant, but I noticed that the Federation were commandeering Jemadar ships, and they were setting up bases on there. And when you're setting up a base, I mean, even in the 24th century, it could imply a certain measure. So in Voyager, after the Dominion War, Seven of Nine said to Chakotay in an episode called The Voyager Conspiracy that nobody could enter another quadrant with the intent of territorial expansion. And I gotta be honest, Deep Space Nine kind of treaded that line a lot, to me. That they weren't really in the Gamma Quadrant to expand their territory, but it seemed like during the Dominion War, I mean, I know there's rules of war, it sort of veered a little uncomfortably close to that. It wasn't, I mean, I know there was hostile actions and everything, but it got a little strange. So I think with First Contact, I agree. They should have kept the Dominion War in the Gamma Quadrant.
Yeah.
Because obviously the Dominion had no such law about territorial expansion. They wanted to go into the Alpha Quadrant and expand as they had in the Gamma Quadrant. But and that created the problem. But it would have been interesting if the writers had kept it in the Gamma Quadrant. Like had Deep Space Nine protected, maybe have the wormhole aliens protecting them from the Dominion, which they did anyway.
Because even after the war ended, the Dominion weren't defeated because they still had their empire in the Gamma Quadrant.
Exactly.
The founders were still there, and they had, all their ships over there. So, and in the end, it really wasn't an ending. All it did was just push them out of the Alpha Quadrant.
It was
But
like an armistice, yeah. It
yeah,
wasn't. It wasn't a real like we're going to end the war. It's all over. The Dominion or no more. It was. It was just like we're going to end this conflict.
yeah. So it was, if they go back into the Gamma Quadrant again, they're still going to run into problems with the Dominion. Unless, of course, Odo is part of the Founders now. He's with them. But there's going to be fallout from it.
Now,
what's that?
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, there's probably going to be, Jeddah are not going to want to go along with the idea of, bowing to another, government. After all the time they've ruled over their own. It's just, there's a lot of things they could explore with that.
Right, and of course, with the Cardassians being basically destroyed as a culture after that, due to their alliance with the of Dominion and Gul Dukat's tampering, which was not good either.
Yeah, but they're not going to be a problem anymore.
Right? Yeah, Cardassians are, But anyway, the thing with Deep Space Nine, though, and this is something I just wonder. Odo was obviously infatuated with the idea of meeting his own people, but being a pretty pragmatic character himself and a security person, and having that very strong ethical sense, being all about justice, I'm wondering if, in some way, Odo couldn't have encouraged the Federation before we get involved with the Dominion and start fighting them. Why don't we try some form of first contact procedure to see if we can't form some sort of reasonable relationship with the Dominion? They sort of try to do that, but they kept coming up with these moral issues they just had to grandstand on. And that tended to be an issue. I think maybe they could have dealt more with the Now, speaking of that, in the movie Insurrection, Riker described the Federation as being involved in Dominion negotiation.
Yeah.
So there must have been some negotiation between the Dominion and the Federation during the war, or before the war even. Something that
they were trying to, ambassadors to try to find them. I think that was part of the, leading up to season 4. They were trying to find out who they were. The Ferengi, I think, had more dealings with people that were associated with
the Tulaberry wine thing. Yeah.
Yeah, but as far as first contact, I don't think the Dominion really wanted it. Yeah. I think they just saw every race as someone that they've got to put under their boot, and so their ultimate goal was total domination of the galaxy, and that ran counter to what Starfleet and Federation stood for.
Now, I'm going to go back to Enterprise for a minute, because this is going to dovetail into a subject that I know you want to discuss, maybe next time even on this podcast, but the first contact with the Klingons. It was already established, I'm trying to think what series it was, the first contact between the Klingons and the Federation was disastrous. Now, when they said disastrous, I assumed it was some big battle, some territorial misunderstanding. In Enterprise, it just seemed that a Klingon kind of crash-landed on Earth. They made a few cultural mistakes and tried to get him home. It really didn't seem very disastrous. It seemed like a relatively benign slip-up.
Well, I guess you could say it was kind of a troubling affair, since they had to deal with the Suliban.
Right, the Suliban were kind of in the middle of that, and they may have been meddling, but as far as it is, the Klingons weren't exactly, barreling Enterprise with all these weapons and blowing parts of it up, or there wasn't some big space battle per se. It was more just this alien race meddling in with taking this Klingon home. Maybe that's disastrous. I don't know. I expected something a little more dramatic, I guess.
Yeah.
Because it was one little Klingon on this planet, on Earth, a language barrier.
A mission, because he had to get back to his home world to give something to the Emperor, I guess, or whoever it was there. Something in his blood, remember?
Yeah, there was an issue with that, yeah.
Something going on there with that. And I think, Vulcan, the Vulcans, I guess they were maybe in some degree they probably knew what was going on, the whole thing, and it just the Klingon crashing on Earth was an accident that wasn't supposed to happen.
Yeah, maybe.
And I don't think they wanted the humans to know who the Klingons were right off like that. That's the impression.
Well, here's one question that I have been thinking about a lot in my head lately, and again refers to kind of Deep Space Nine, Next Generation. There are some now when we first encounter the Bajorans in the Next Generation, and they were called the Bajora at first, which I find very interesting. But when Bajora/Bajorans, when the Federation first encountered them, Picard talked about reading about the achievements of the ancient Bajora, in that case, in history class, and the Cardassian occupation of that planet. So I'm wondering, how long did Earth know about the Bajorans? Were they a legend that were talked about like Aldea during the 22nd century? Had there been some attempt at a first contact, maybe in Captain Archer's time or in Kirk's time? How do you think that worked?
Well, maybe that way, or they probably got information from some other race that knew them.
Maybe.
Maybe they just shared that knowledge to them, over the course of, of years and stuff, and said, right. Oh, we know this race of people, and this is some of the things they've done, and and maybe they kind of gathered some of that information that way.
And also
about that was, you see, when Enterprise, they went like all the way out to what the heck, that planet there where they're on shore leave there all the time. There, Riker likes to go to. What's the name?
Risa. They went to Risa.
When they went to Risa, I was like, ain't that a bit far?
That's a pretty far out thing, even in the Next Generation. I mean, there's a lot of planets between that.
Travel at Warp 5, that would have taken them a couple of years at least, to get out there at the most. I mean, and they traversed that in like a week or two or something. I mean,
we could probably do paper this site with podcast about the inconsistencies of Enterprise. If you actually look at it really closely, it gets really insane if you actually follow it closely. I haven't followed it that closely. There are some obvious things that just don't jive, but the thing is, like
it kind of, they should have just left certain things that were Next Generation alone, and just made up their own stuff.
Right, unless somehow Reza is a transdimensional planet. I don't know how that could be, but I mean,
it moves around.
Moves from one place to the other. I don't know. But, like, okay, maybe it's like an unstable wormhole. It's like, okay, it's going to be in this sector today, but be a little closer to this area because it's convenient for Warp 5 to get there,
It travels.
Right. The amazing moving shore leave planet. Now, just a little joke I had it when I saw the Rise episode. I said, why wouldn't the Enterprise crew go to Wrigley's Pleasure Planet?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what that guy in the Man Trap mentioned. I don't know if he was being sarcastic, but why don't we go to Wrigley's Pleasure Planet, whatever that is supposed to be? But that would be more appropriate.
That would have been perfect.
Find out who Wrigley is.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a crazy thing to say in the first Star Trek, but hey, Wrigley's Pleasure Planet, it may be closer than Risa.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that sounds weird, but
could have been a great opportunity to see something that we didn't see yet,
Right, but like I said, maybe first contact with Wrigley's Pleasure Planet. I don't know, whatever. Just maybe do some TOS stuff, that kind of thing. But like I said, in terms of first contact, in the end of the day, there was a lot of things they did. Voyager did a lot of wonderful things with first contact. Deep Space Nine, I'll say, had the most on this issue, and with TOS had a lot of it, as you said, were missed opportunities.
Yeah.
There were a lot of chances where they could have done it. Apollo is a good example. You made a good point there that, okay, so this guy has this giant hand, or this entity has this giant hand on the ship. And Picard's like, and Kirk's like, I want my ship out of it. I want my ship back. Instead of saying, well, let's study him first before we ask that,
The way I would have liked to have seen that episode end was that some people on the Enterprise would want to stay behind and learn from him, and maybe teach him of how Earth is today, or how it is in the future.
Yeah.
And and see if he would be more inclined to just want to go back to Earth and
right. Exactly.
would have been a better ending, I think, than just blowing up his temple and depriving him of his power and stuff like that. Because that to me seemed counter to trying to learn from a life form.
Exactly. And I think another good way to end it, instead of because he obviously saw Carolyn Palamas as a love interest, she could have been one of those people who stayed behind and led the research team.
Yeah.
And she could have been there to study Apollo and to learn what he thought of humanity and explain to them how humanity had evolved since he'd been to Earth.
Yeah, I mean, they did that before when they ran across that Earth duplicate and all the kids, and there was only kids on them. Yeah, and when they were done with their trying to find a cure, they left people behind to try to help. Right,
sociologists. They didn't say, okay, we're going to give you this cure, and okay, only you're on your own. They didn't do that. They didn't make them into human children.
Right.
Or they didn't say, we're going to blow up your cities and just leave you there with a cure and hope for the best. They sent sociologists there to bring them to a human form. Now, they were children, and I suppose that there's that moral issue with them. Well, they were kind of, sort of, not children, but they were children emotionally and physically. They were older, but it was a story. But, I think with Apollo, they assume he's an entity. Maybe Kirk, in a way, was intimidated by Apollo and thought that if I don't destroy him, he'll destroy us. A very basic thing.
He seemed adamant on agitating him to the point of attacking people in his crew. I mean, if you don't just go up and stand toe to toe with somebody and bark at them and then expect them just to
I know, and that's why Star Trek was good, because each series evolved. Now, if Picard had handled Apollo, I think it would have been a very different situation.
Yeah.
I think it would have, because in the first season, which everybody picks on, maybe a little unfairly, of The Next Generation, just my personal thing, I've watched it a lot over the years, I remember it new. One of the little cliches that Picard would often say in the end of the episode, I think he said it maybe 3 or 4 times, I wish we had a chance to learn more about that. He'd often say that.
Yeah.
And, Kirk was like, well, here's a little lesson we learned about this alien, a head warp factor 5, Mr. Sulu. Whatever. Yeah. It was like, let's get out of here before we have to deal with this. It was always, again, Western, space Western. Let's ride off into the sunset on Hi-Ho Enterprise, whatever.
Yeah.
So, I think that with Picard's ship, it was like Carnival Cruise, or a big luxury ship. And the idea was we're going to have a more luxurious and elegant way of dealing with people. Voyager's not as elegant, but I think with First Contact, there was science. Now, Voyager is a science vessel, multi-purpose, maybe to be a battleship sometimes, right? Like a multi-purpose vessel for specific missions. Would you describe Voyager like that?
Yeah. But, you look at that, what was it, the first season where they encountered the Edo?
Yeah.
And Picard, when I was watching that episode for the first time, I was always thinking, if Kirk was the one in command of that, they would have probably tried to attack the entity.
Yeah. The same as with Apollo. They would have done that. But Data...
and he would have put Wesley out of there, and the hell with the Prime Directive or whatever.
Yeah, take Wesley out of there. We don't care about you. You're doing the wrong thing. But with Picard and Data, they're studying this life form, and Picard gives one of his speeches. In that case, there can be no justice so long as laws are absolute.
Yeah.
Which is actually not a bad speech. And again, with the Prime Directive, I think that's important to know. That can be a subject for another blog. With First Contact, that also makes sense. The First Contact law might have been established in a very bland way before Kirk, because you can kind of tell that Kirk missed opportunities for First Contact by just, we got to solve this problem and forget you,
Yeah.
And with Picard, they had very strict First Contact procedures by the 24th century.
That's right.
And one knows how they could deal with that. So is there any other subjects that you thought would be relevant to First Contact that you wanted to bring up in this?
One thing was I was thinking, where would they take that policy into the future? I mean, let's go like another 100 years. How would they deal with First Contact later?
Well,
I mean, you have all these worlds now, part of the Federation.
Yeah.
And there's like some worlds that I don't know how many would be left that aren't warp capable. I mean, would they look at the bigger picture and figure, well, maybe as a galaxy or as we need to all come together or something, and maybe the First Contact rules, non-interference rules, would be a little more lax, I guess, because now they're trying to get everybody
Well,
together, because it's like the Earth itself, and in the United States is out there giving certain
yeah.
arm stuff to all these lesser developed cultures and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So it's like I think in the future when more of the galaxy's been explored, you'd probably see more of that going on where they're trying to bring the whole galaxy together. Uh, and
I
maybe the
think
first.
that a good thing you mentioned in our last podcast in relation to families on starships, maybe you didn't mention it in that, maybe we just were talking. You were
Yeah,
talking about in the future, in a future of Star Trek we don't know, maybe in the 25th century, rather than
yeah,
sending away teams to hazardous worlds, they would be sending hologram isomorphic versions down to scout the situation out. Now, I'm
avatars.
wondering if first contact procedure might work like that. They might put holograms in that situation first. And to extend on that, I'm wondering, if you look at Voyager, we're dealing with methods of locomotion that are very much outside of warp drive. We have quantum slipstream drive, which is dangerous, but they've been experimenting with that. You also have Borg transwarp technology. Now, we have to wonder if in some future, those technologies the Federation were using could bring in extragalactic travel. If we were, as I suggested one time, meeting up with races like the Kelvins in Andromeda, where travel between those galaxies could happen in a matter of weeks or months rather than centuries. So
Yeah,
you got to figure they
yeah,
may be encountering alien races and making first contact in other galaxies and other galactic clusters, and they might have to make other procedures. Like an idea is to create holographic avatars to make contact with races that may not be humanoid.
yeah,
Um, for example, in Voyager, 7 of 9 mentioned something called Galactic Cluster 3, which was, how did she put it? Transdimensional energy plane, material plane, I think, that intersected omnicordial life forms, which she described as being an unhumanoid. Now,
yeah,
if they, like in that movie Avatar, if the Federation could use holographic avatars to make first contact with that species on their own terms, that would be an interesting future event to explore. First
mm,
contact using these avatars. In
yeah.
the,
And to further that idea, I was thinking, sometime in the future, they using those avatars and different methods of exploring technology, with their technologies, would they find life living in the center of a star?
exact. I don't know if
Yeah,
you read Arthur C. Clarke's 2001, 10, 2061 series of books. I don't know if you read
I
that.
read up to the 2010. I didn't read the rest of it.
Well, in 2061, it dealt with, because if you know what happened, they destroyed Jupiter in that series.
Hmm.
So they could create life on this moon of it, Io, this monolith thing. In 2061, the character, David Bowman, he's become the star child or whatever, and HAL 9000, they're merged together. They find
Yeah,
out that when they destroyed Jupiter, they didn't conceive that there were life forms living inside Jupiter who were gaseous,
yeah,
and that they were trying to protect survivors on another moon of Jupiter that wasn't Io. So, we could deal with ethical dilemmas like that in that future Star Trek. Life in other life that live within stars. Did we destroy life in previous time periods without realizing it? Remember Next
yeah,
Generation delved into that with the those crystalline creatures on that Valera 3.
yeah, yeah,
We could deal with life forms like that just or life force creatures that we might accidentally destroy or might accidentally be destroyed by something they do, and communicate with them on different levels. Or the crystalline entity, we don't know where that's really from.
yeah. That's true.
That could be from some totally different place. That could be from a collection of life forms in some other galactic cluster.
Yeah,
That could be one of those omnicordial life forms from Galactic Cluster 3 for all we know.
could revisit that world there where Riker found that casino.
Oh yeah,
And
that planet where there was like they created this casino around. We
really
never
got
saw
to
that alien
know,
race at all, did we?
we never got to really know the life on that world or whatever it was.
Well,
So
one thing that
humans,
inspired what?
so I was just going to say the humans were just part of a game board. It seemed to them.
Right. They were like movable piece, like hologram type things, I guess.
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
one thing they mentioned on Voyager that would be interesting to use in a first contact in the future was the idea of particle synthesis, almost like
yeah,
partially replicating people,
yeah,
not a little beyond holograms. Maybe that could be used for an avatar. And,
Yeah.
you know, another blog topic I want to do, and this could be a rabbit hole too, but I'll just put it out here as an idea. Big time theatrical films, some of whom which have been directed by John Cameron, that took ideas off Star Trek episodes. But anyway, we could go into that all day. I see it a lot. But anyway, the point I'm making is that the Avatar idea could be good in the future Star Trek, because obviously you wouldn't want a bunch of life forms that didn't have any particular humanoid form to have to encounter a life form totally unfamiliar to them.
Yeah.
You know, there could be some familiarity, and then they could explain what they do and how they do it, and easily ease into what they are, and there could be an openness there somehow. So it's like, well, we can't really interact with you a lot, but through these avatars, we can learn to understand how you function. You know,
and it's safer for the crew. I mean,
exactly.
That way.
So, but yeah, that's a possible future first contact idea that might work. So, is there anything you wanted to go into a little bit more?
How about the idea that maybe because they can do that, that starship travel would be kind of fading away because they can project themselves with avatars all galaxy, you know?
Maybe. I don't know. But Star Trek, I don't know. I mean, it would be a little weird without a starship, but you know, but you know how humans are. Humans do tend to limit themselves to a certain degree, but they could face that. We don't need starships anymore because we can just project ourselves in an unlimited way if we put priority on it. But, you know, there's always a human need to explore and have that environment. So you could use that as a short-range thing, perhaps, and bring up that argument, you know.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, with Star Trek, you know, you've got to have some human connection to make it work. But, you know, what I don't want to see in Star Trek in the future is to have it be, oh, you know what? And I hope Discovery doesn't do this. I'm just mentioning that as an aside. I don't consider that Prime, per se. But the attitude that, well, this is not actually in Star Trek's past at all. This is in a future where the Federation was wrecked and they had to start out from ground zero. And we're redoing the whole Federation. I don't want to see it done that way. And I don't want to see a future series actually do that. Like, we had to do the whole Starfleet thing over again because we got messed up the first time. That would have been, you know, don't do that.
I just look at Discovery as an alternate timeline.
Right. Yeah, like I said, this is TrekPrime. We're not into discussing that. But I'm just saying, I don't want to see a future Star Trek say, well, this is in the Prime timeline. It's in the 25th century, but it's going to look like it's before TOS because they screwed everything up and they don't have it right. But yeah, you know, I think, you know, the Avatar idea is good, but it should be explored in a way that expresses humanity and its need to explore, yet have its limits too. Because that's one of the themes of Star Trek. The exploration and expansion have their limits. And that's a part of First Contact. We can't just go in there and say, hi, we're human, you've got to like us. You know, it doesn't work that way. You've got to understand the culture, know how they are, and not just... Basically, First Contact precludes Manifest Destiny, which I feel is probably a good thing in the future. Yeah. And is there anything else you wanted to mention aside that?
No, I guess that covers it.
All right. So next week we're going to be back with another episode of Trek Prime. And Jeff's going to pick the subject next week. So I hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, live long and prosper.
Here.